What follows is a lecture on critical methodologies used in Old Testament criticism. A number of critical methodologies are used in scholarly biblical criticism. Source criticism, form criticism, rhetorical criticism, and literary approaches. And one of the questions that will come up is, can those of us who are conservative evangelicals use these methodologies and still remain conservative? First of these methods is source criticism. Source criticism seeks to understand a literary piece better by determining the sources used by the author and/or redactor, another fancy term for editor, who put the literary piece together. Now, some scholars will call this literary criticism, though I use that for a different type of method. In any case, it's tied to the historical critical approach. So what exactly is the historical critical approach? This historical critical approach has been influenced by historians. Historians, when they're trying to reconstruct history, try to find sources, and they examine those sources to try to date them as a first step in evaluating a source's historical reliability. Presumably, the closer a source is to the event it describes, the more one can trust it. Biblical historical critics do much the same thing. They look at the biblical text and try to discern within the text sources used by the biblical authors. They try to date those sources, and that's part of the process of determining how reliable the sources and therefore the texts, the narratives of history used by the biblical authors might be. And because of this emphasis on historical methodology, that's why there was such an interest in trying to identify sources in the Bible, such as the alleged sources behind the Pentateuch. The historical critical approach has certain assumptions. One, it assumes that the Bible is to be studied like any other book. Two, it thinks that the Bible has a history of composition and transmission. Three, the sources or authors used by the biblical writers can be determined. Scholars can find internal statements or changes of characteristics of style or repetitions or the like, and from that deduce where sources have been used, and maybe an author has gone from one source to another source. Now, such evidence can even lead one to reject the claims of authorship or unity that is made by a document. Another assumption is that the Bible is a human book and the human purposes and aims are the object of study. Now let me make some comments on these things. It is true that the Bible is in many ways like any other book. It does have a history of how it was written. It does have human purposes and aims. I would even agree that in principle, claims made by a literary work can be overturned by analysis. A famous example of this is Lorenzo Valla, who studied a work called The Donation of Constantine, which claimed to be from Emperor Constantine, that gave certain privileges to the papal state. And Lorenzo Valla demonstrated by literary analysis that this work was fictitious, that it was not written by Constantine, but rather it was written centuries after Constantine, because there were so many statements that did not fit the time, what we would call anachronisms. Now, in putting together the text, there's a related aspect of the study to source criticism called redaction criticism, that studies how an editor used his sources to create a new literary work. This could be applied in the case of the chronicler who appears to have used Samuel and Kings as a source. And if you ask the question, well, how did he use that source and how did he modify it? Well, then you're doing redaction criticism. Now, there are many cases where source critics come up with alleged sources which are dubious as to whether or not they really existed. We'll see this when we examine the documentary hypothesis that source critics tend to say come from sources they label J and E and D and P, but we will argue that they are sources that never existed, in at least the way that the documentary hypothesis assumes. And other places where source critics separate the book of Isaiah into three sources or authors, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah, or Zechariah into 1st and 2nd Zechariah, these things can be challenged as to whether or not they really existed. On the other hand, there are places where clearly the biblical authors are using sources. One place where this occurs in Ezra and Nehemiah. There are autobiographical sections in both Ezra and Nehemiah where Ezra speaks in first person about himself, sometimes called the Ezra Memoirs. And in Nehemiah, sometimes Nehemiah speaks in first person about himself. This is called the Nehemiah Memoir. And other sections are by narrators who talk about Ezra or who talk about Nehemiah in third person. And so there, you have three different sources: the Ezra Memoirs, the Nehemiah Memoirs, and the narrator, who seems to be different than either one. And then there's letters of Persian kings, to and from Persian kings, that are found in Ezra and Nehemiah. Presumably these too are sources that existed outside of Ezra and Nehemiah. And there's lists of various persons or things that were brought back from exile, lists of priests, lists of leaders, and it's not unreasonable to think that those lists existed before they were incorporated into the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, there are places where the Bible itself identifies its own sources. You have the book of the Acts of Solomon and Kings. You have the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah in 1 Kings, which, by the way, is not to be confused with our book of Chronicles. It's rather a source used by the writer of Kings, the archival material from the palace. And then there's the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, mentioned also in 1 Kings. There's the book of Jasar in several places, the book of the Wars of the Lord. All of these are sources that the Bible itself identifies as being used by the biblical writer. With reasonable guesswork, we can deduce some sources. In Genesis, the genealogies, in most cases, were utilized rather than created by biblical authors. Chronicles uses Samuel and Kings as a source, it would appear. Now, what are we to think of source criticism as a methodology? It does have some strengths. Certainly some biblical authors use sources, and discerning sources can help in analyzing what the text is doing. And source criticism rightly points out that in many ways the Bible is a human book, and studying the human side of the Bible, in particular the sources used by the writers, is a legitimate exercise. But there are weaknesses as well. It often is overly speculative, finding sources, quote unquote, that probably never existed. It tends to exalt the source over the text. I mean, if you find the source used by the text, well, that can add something to your analysis. But it's kind of like studying Shakespeare and Julius Caesar. If you figure out where he got his history from, that really doesn't tell you much about the play Julius Caesar, one very minor aspect of it. It's the final form of the text, not the sources that were used by the authors, that's canonical and important religiously. And then another weakness is that source criticism is often combined with an anti-supernatural bias. The Bible is a human book, but it's much more than a human book. And many source critics read the text with a rationalism that would be dangerous for us evangelicals to adopt. The next lecture will be on form criticism, but that's in a separate video.